dual-wielding laptops at the moment. I would like to introduce Hugh, who is a really good friend of ours and a really good friend of mine, and he was so nice to say yes, because I was like, oh my God, I need someone awesome to speak at Everything Open. So I won't actually introduce him because he is going to do a significant amount of introducing of himself, I think. But he is awesome, and he will give us a little treat at the end, hopefully, fingers crossed. He is the engineering director leading Grafana Labs, and I would like to introduce Hugh.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you for that gracious introduction. I'm humbled and quite honoured to be doing the keynote today for our first ever Everything Open, and my thanks to the organising team for putting it on. I have to say, looking at the program with Rebecca, Lindsay and Seb later in the week, I'm kind of glad I'm on first because they'd be bloody hard acts to follow. I'm curious, and who was at Sydney for LinuxConf 2018 and saw my keynote there? A few of you, okay. So this is going to seem eerily familiar in places, and unfortunately the jokes will be much the same, so my apologies there. My initial titles or subtitle for this was some observations from 35 years in tech, but I think this byline is probably a little more accurate. Learn from my mistakes, thus you might avoid repeating them. I don't make any claims that my story and the various anecdotes I'm going to share are anything particularly special, but I've been really fortunate over the years to work with and for some of the best people, I think, in our industry. And while their brilliance may not have rubbed off, I certainly did notice a few things along the way, and I'll try and impart those today. A lot of that time in my career has been working in the overall open technical commons. One way or another. But before digging into that, I'll go back a little bit in time. My life story is probably only of interest to my mum, bless her, but there's a few things I think that are relevant to set some context. I'm largely self-taught. Started pulling things apart, doing electronics, ham radio, that kind of thing from about 8 years of age. But school was always a bit of a struggle. I wasn't very good at maths, and it's interesting as you talk to people, oh, you work in computing, you must be really good at maths. And I'm not. I really struggled with it. And a lot of my school reports were along the lines of Blemings would do better if he applied himself. And this sort of sets the scene for some of the stuff I'll talk about a little bit later. That's me with my pride and joy. Well, I guess technically the family's pride and joy, a Commodore 4016 with a massive 16 kilobytes of RAM. It was an 1 megahertz 6502 CPU. I showed this same photo in 2018, and I told then the story how wonderful it was when we got the upgrade to 32K, and I've since found a kind of a cool photo just recently. This is a shot of part of the motherboard of that particular system, and this shows you the lengths that the manufacturers would then go to make it hard for you to upgrade the memory. Of course, that's showing 4 of the 8 memory chips in the system. Of course, the enterprising hardware hackers of the day simply soldered the chips in anyway and used blue wires to link them across. Now, that sort of hack is pretty easy to do at a megahertz. It's fair to say you're not going to do that on a DDR4 or DDR5 system. That computer was also formative to me, I guess in a different way, because through it I also got my first exposure to electronic music, and I guess thinking back to it now, would broadly be the precursor to chiptune sort of stuff, and this is even before SID chips, but it was that was to create some surprising opportunities for me later, and also put me on a path to buy my first of too many synthesizers, and from that a lifelong love of music. Now, I'm not going to talk, unfortunately, too much about microprocessors on this keynote, but I couldn't resist the temptation to put at least a die photo. In this case, this is back in 1975. This is a 6502 with about 3,500 transistors. A modern Power 10 CPU from IBM, part of the Open Power ecosystem, has got 36 billion. That's 7 orders of magnitude more. We really have come quite a long way. But to finish up the intros, I guess through a rather unexpected series of events, including me working in the music shop and having a particular customer ask me a question about MIDI, to which I replied, oh, it's 31.25 kilobaud, 8 bits, and it's 5 milliamp current loop opto isolators. Like, why are you working in a music shop? Sort of thing. Why don't you go and explore things professionally? Which I then did. Went off and worked in an engineering firm doing electronics design and embedded programming, and in particular got my start doing C and assembler. And I think it was quite a useful way to start. A lot of twists and turns since. including a wonderful time at the Open Power Foundation, which I'll touch on briefly later on, but now I'm at Grafana and leading a particularly wonderful bunch of people, and back to what I've realised is one of my real passions in a professional sense, and that is people management. I should say too, while Grafana has supported me in getting here today, I'm speaking for myself only for the most part in this session. Anyway, on to something a bit more topical, Linux Australia. So I've done a few retrospectives in the past of linux.conf.au, the conference itself, but this time I'm going to try and focus a little bit more on Linux Australia proper. The two are obviously quite inexorably linked, but I think it's time we gave LA its due in these sorts of events. Courtesy of the Wayback Machine, we have the LA website. I know, right? So to set the scene, it's 1997, 98, around that severe, and pretty much all the Australian states and territories have a Linux user group of some kind. And we need to remember that back at that particular point in time, installing Linux was quite difficult. It was by no means a given that it would work on your hardware, that sort of thing. So lugs played a particularly important role in just bootstrapping that initial experience for people. Terry Dawson and Gary Allpike, who are two members of the Sydney Linux user group, got chatting, and they figured that, well, we're starting to see all these state-based, state-based user groups. Maybe we need some sort of umbrella organisation so we can share the load where it makes sense to do so, and have a common voice to government and those sorts of things. Some lugs are in favour, others were less so, which sort of sounds familiar with to this day to some extent. But this is certainly the conversation kind of got kicked off. And bear in mind, all this has been done, and everything actually I'm going to talk about today for the most part is being done by volunteers. But around the same time, there's a certain Linux kernel developer from Adelaide was making some rumblings about running an open source conference. This is Rusty Russell. Rusty's aim was to bring together the Australian and international Linux communities, and sort of this being in these early days, it was not a given that a lot of these contacts had been made. So he approached the organisers of the still under formation Linux Australia and said, look, I'd really like to run this conference. Do you think you could help out with the insurance, sort of be the body that sits behind this? And as Terry tells the story, this prompted them to take their conversations and, yeah, we should do something, to gee, we better get something done. So they incorporated Linux Australia in New South Wales in order to facilitate amongst other things, to facilitate the running of Caloo. Terry was the first president of the organisation. The apocryphal stories about Rusty funding Caloo on his credit cards are actually true. He did actually get his money back, and whatever was left over, I think he then donated back to Linux Australia. This is an era where we had no networking, no Wi-Fi, and Slashdot was kind of at the heights of its powers, so people actually printed it off each morning so people could get their Slashdot fix. This is the, where are we now, 2000. So this is a little bit later. This is the LA website in November 2000, and Terry tells a nice story about the jobs board, which you can see on the left there, about three down. The jobs board has kind of been a feature of Linux Australia pretty well since 2000 and pretty much and to this day. Terry tells the story that he was looking for a job, and he saw a post on there from this company called Dolby Labs, pretty well known, right? Who needed a system administrator, come programmer, come general Linux guru, and he's in fact there to this day, some 23 years on, so something to be said for that. The still running install fests is still a common thing. To give some quick context there, as I mentioned earlier, sort of installing Linux is by no means trivial, but even downloading the ISOs, or more likely the floppy images you needed to install, was a not inconsequential task on a slow modem connection, so install fests were particularly popular. You can't see it, but it's down the bottom. You can see that. Go and have a look on the Wayback Machine if you want more, but this, at that point, Linux Australia was sponsored by Digital, who now sadly defunct, became Compact and then was assumed into HP. Around the same time, we had the first linux.conf.au. Anand Kumri and the Sydney crew ran what became the first event, and that kind of kicked first linux.conf.au, and that kicked off what's become the norm, or was the norm, I suppose, for LCAs to be a roving conference. Rusty swore he'd never run another conference again, but he did still stay involved, and he auctioned off a couple of T-shirts, and there's quite a nice synergy from this to what Sarah was just mentioning with the raffle, that this concept of fundraising has been an important part of the overall Linux Australia makeup, particularly with our events for many, many years now, with thousands and thousands of dollars going to various good causes, both within the tech sector but also external to that. But this is to the point where Linux Australia really started gaining some momentum. And in 2002, Anand was voted from the Sid Linux Users Group, was voted in as president. Then in 2003, we saw Peter Andrews elected as president, and this sort of starts the period which, in my view, and I think that of many, indeed Terry was also of this view, this is really where Linux Australia, as we now know it today, really started to kick into gear when we had the powerhouse that was Peter sort of driving things along. 2004, a little bit of a website revamp, a new logo for Linux Australia. But back in 2003 was a somewhat significant event for us for linux.conf.au and I guess the overall open source ecosystem in Australia. It's the first time Linus Torvald showed up to one of the sessions. He actually appeared in a penguin suit at LCA in Perth, which was kind of funny. But perhaps rather foolishly, Linus said, well, look, I'll come back, but only if you organise a dunk tank, which of course the Adelaide team were more than happy to oblige. 2005 Installfest are very much a thing. LA website from that period knows the AGM, those sorts of things. And Andrew Tridge was talking about interoperability with version control systems at LCA in 2005. It's one of those kind of funny, if you were there, you know, but for those of you that weren't present, Tridge wrote a tool that was allowed interoperability with a particular proprietary version control system, which at the time, somewhat controversially, was being used to manage the Linux source code versioning and so forth. It's fair to say, I think, that was a catalyst for Linus to actually go on and write Git, the source code management tool that we all know and mostly love to this day. And it was interesting, I was talking to Linus when we were in New Zealand for LCA a couple of years ago, and he explained that these days he's actually better known for his work on Git than on the Linux kernel itself. And staying on LCA for a moment, this is also the first time we crossed the ditch over to and ran an LCA in New Zealand. We've always enjoyed a very collegiate relationship with our lovely cousins across the sea, and this is the first time we had an LCA in 2006. The gentleman pictured is perhaps not as well known as he should be, but it's Van Jacobson, who is the author of the TCP/IP header compression algorithm, a deep underpinning of everything that even to this day in the modern internet. The story goes that Van Jacobson was wandering around, so no one was really quite sure who he was, but he offered to help, and I said, "Well, sure, can you crimp network cables?" And sure, okay. So off he went. That's back to Linux Australia. The other thing I wanted to pull out on this particular side, 2006, we see Linux Australia being very active in advocacy to government, and that's something that's continued to this day as LA has sought and I think been quite effective in being one of particular voices to the Australian public sector around open source policy and that sort of thing. So what else has Linux Australia done? Well, glad you asked. Well, it's fair to say that LCA or linux.conf.au has been a big part of what LA has done over the years, but it's by no means the only thing, and it's done much more than just facilitating LCA. It's auspiced many other conferences, as we've listed there, and we were talking at dinner last night with a few friends from the open community, and we reckon all told the number of attendees for LA run or auspiced events over the years must be well over 10,000 people by now, which is quite impressive for a small volunteer-run organisation. LA also has a grant scheme, I think still, do we? Yes, I think we do, yes. Please enrol, please apply. There's money there for good causes to facilitate open source related projects. LA's run various different awards at different points along the way, done member surveys and generally looked at engagement. But all this is very much on as I said, being run by volunteers. Now, there's a little bit of audience participation at this point, if you may. I'm just going to have a quick drink of water. Thank you. I'm done. So, can I ask, if you've been involved in a voluntary capacity with Linux Australia or any of the conferences or other activities in Australia and New Zealand and you're comfortable doing so, would you just take a moment to stand so we can see who all these wonderful people are? I think a bit of a show of appreciation for Thanks for that. Thanks for that. So speaking of volunteers and that sort of stuff, this is going to be my one rant or approximately. You know, most people know I'm not really the ranty kind of a type. I was reflecting on Linux Australia and the whole the concept of volunteering in the open source community as a whole, and particularly with some events over the last 18 months, and I'm actually choosing my words a little carefully here. I'm not just pausing for dramatic effect. But one of the things that I continue to be amazed by is the simple absence of kindness in many of our interactions when we're dealing on, particularly on the mailing list, and particularly the thing that sort of nearly got me getting really, really ranty was some discussions on the Linux Australia mailing list. Indeed, sometimes the vitriol that we have on these lists. You just saw a bunch of people standing up who have volunteered in Linux Australia. These are the people that when the protagonists, the people who could perhaps have paused and not sent that email or thought a little bit more deeply or phrased it in a different way or perhaps even phrased it as a private inquiry rather than an accusatory, why the hell are you doing sort of thing. These are the people you're attacking. I'd encourage all of you, you're all fine, I'm sure it's no one in this room, but those that are watching online. But I would really deeply encourage all of you to think about approaching your future interactions on the Linux Australia mailing list, and indeed anything in our overall open technical commons, with a bit of kindness. And remember that you're dealing with volunteers in every case. Thank you. All right, that's the rant over. There was one more, but that involves, and when you're writing applications, please don't overcommit memory, because in virtualised environments it's really, really hard to sort of fake that. But we'll wait and let some expert actually sort of talk about that at some point in the future. But it's anyway, and I have one bad joke. Speaking of programming languages, I have an assertion to make. All right, okay. So, I don't normally read my slides, but I will in this case. My assertion is that between Australia and New Zealand, we have for our population one of the most wonderfully vibrant free and open source communities in the world. It's not without its flaws and wobbles, to be sure, but we have a positive impact out of proportion with the modest population of the two countries in question. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying this to be nationalistic, I'm just making an observation about so population density and population size, but all of us here and those watching are part of a wonderful technical commons. So I thought it might be nice just to take a moment to acknowledge some of the people, projects and companies from Australia and New Zealand have been key to that success, and just to illustrate how rich that heritage we have. So this is a bit of an eye chart, and if you're in my 2018 talk, you would have seen a similar thing. It has been updated, but basically what I sought to do here was saying, well, who are the people that I've admired and projects, both people, projects and companies over the years, and then I talked to a few of those and pulled out a few names and a few projects. This will be available online, so you can look later, but it's clearly not exhaustive. That would be a much denser slide, and I'm sure I've made omissions and errors, in which case they're mine, and I do apologise. But I thought I'd just take a few minutes to call out a few that come to mind, just to give some examples of the wonderful contributions that the Australian New Zealand free and open source software community has made to the broader open technical commons. The first one, which I nearly missed, is, and embarrassingly, I actually brought the John Lyons text to be able to hold up, which of course is in my bag, so I'm not going to jump off stage, but maybe we'll pass it around later. So the Lyons commentary on Unix in 1976 included source code, which was at the time the only real documentation available on Unix, I should say, outside Bell Labs. And of significance was the fact that the 6th edition allowed classroom use of the source code. The 7th and subsequent editions did not, which made it the book spread meant basically the book spread like wildfire on the photocopy machine, because once you couldn't buy the new edition, the older copy version became quite valuable. But it's commonly held to be one of the most copied books in computer science, which I think is not bad for an Australian-based computer scientist, John Lyons. It occurs to me too, it's almost 50 years ago, so I guess in 2026 we should probably think about some sort of appropriate commemoration or recognition of that milestone. Peter Andrews will need relatively little introduction, I suspect, to this particular group, but as I mentioned earlier, P was instrumental in kicking on Linux Australia in 2003. She's since gone on to do GovHack Open Data, normalising open source basically just about everywhere she went in the process. Vic Oliver from across the ditch, hails from New Zealand. He was instrumental in the development of a device called the RepRap, which is considered by most to be the cause, as it were, of the 3D printing revolution. And Vic actually demoed an early incarnation of the RepRap, I think, at LCA in 2005. And I remember being there, it's just like, oh my gosh, I'm seeing the future kind of thing. Because the whole concept of 3D printing at that time, while it was easy to understand intuitively, it was quite a different thing to actually seeing it happening in front of you. New Zealand Minister Claire Curran did a lot of work in driving openness in New Zealand government, perhaps slightly less so in politics more broadly, but another great contributor to the Open Technical Commons from New Zealand. So that's obviously only a snapshot, but you get the general idea. But it's, I think, a great community to be a part of, and all of us here are part of that, but also a good one to work in. So I'm going to touch a little bit about working on free and open source software and open hardware. As I said, I've been fortunate enough to work in the field on and off for quite a while. I'm going to mostly avoid in these next few slides and the general remarks talking about general work-related things and try and confine my remarks to open source specific pieces. And if you haven't already guessed, this talk is going to jump around a little bit, and there'll be the reasons for that will become apparent in about six slides time. So first up, you thought, how do I find a role in open source? And I think that the obvious, while it's tempting just to go into one of the job search engines, I think often, even to this day, you do better just reaching out through your own human networks, your local user groups. We're at a conference, networking, the hallway track. That's the thing, are all opportunities to just find out about what's there on the ground, because often the interesting jobs aren't advertised or are only lightly advertised because they're in such demand. The Linux Australia jobs section is another good place to work. If you're working in a free and open source project already, then reaching out through the network you have there. The one thing I would encourage you to do, though, is think about where would be a fit for you. I think that we're in a pretty tricky job market at the moment, it's fair to say, and I think some large companies have made some particularly foolish decisions recently. But that aside, while it may seem there's not a lot of choice out there at the moment, I think it still makes sense to take the time to try and find somewhere that's actually going to align with you. Does their core business align with your values, for example? What are your views on whether you want to be working local versus remote versus some kind of hybrid? And importantly, what does the corporate culture sort of feel like? What's the reputation of the company? So keep all these sorts of things in mind. I had a bit of a chat with our recruiting team and just got some current sort of best practices, I suppose, from them just to make sure these were still relevant. Be visible in the projects that are relevant. So if you're applying for a job and saying I'm a lead developer on such and such a project, or I've contributed such and such a project, you can be sure that the recruiters in the modern recruiting process will look at your LinkedIn, your GitHub and all those other places and just see what your profile is online. Now, if you don't have one, it doesn't matter, but just don't talk it up unnecessarily. Just be honest, because it will be checked. Be yourself, but be business friendly. So be mindful that people, as part of the modern recruiting process, people are going to look out there and just see what your track record looks like, particularly from an employment standpoint, and have an accurate LinkedIn presence. While LinkedIn may still be slightly controversial to some, the reality is that recruiters do look at it, and it's better to have even just a basic entry so you at least appear than none at all. You get to the application negotiation process. So do your homework on the organisation, know who you're approaching or what they do, and talk to the people that work there if you possibly can. And that's often not too hard to do. Spend some time on interview prep. If you don't know your stuff, it's okay, but don't knock your water bottle over onto the electronics on the floor. Know your stuff, but don't sweat the interview process. And one of the things I would contend, I actually feel kind of strongly about this one, is that I think all modern, sensible companies, nice places you probably actually want to work, structure their interview process so that they're trying to help you to shine, not trip you up. And I've been through both, and the latter is certainly a much more pleasant way to be. But I would assert that most companies you likely to want to work will end up being more in that sort of vein. Think about your salary expectations and stick to them. Valerie Roy had a really brilliant page on this, and I looked earlier in the week and I could no longer find it, but I could find someone linking to it which has similar sorts of ideas. But there's some excellent ideas there, and the basic premise there is that have realistic expectations, not too high, not too low, not too high, but also not too low when it comes to negotiating a salary, because once you're in the role, it's very, very difficult to get a step change. So you kind of want to get that right, and you don't want to be in a job and then finding out that I could have asked for X% more. Ask about keeping copyright for your code. That should be pretty much a no-brainer for most modern open source, open hardware related companies. So you got the job. Now what? This is one that I thought was important to point out in particular, because I'm now back in the fortunate position of managing a team once again, and we've had a bunch of new people start working as part of my team over the course of the last 12, 18 months. And there's been a consistent thing I've noticed is that people worry about getting into the groove too quickly. Most companies will expect you to take 2 to 3 months, possibly more, to really get established. So please don't come into a role and feel, oh gosh, it's the second week, I've got to know everything. You don't. It's almost certainly in a complex code base, they probably don't want you playing with production just as yet until you've really found your feet and know what you're doing. So don't sweat that initial few weeks of getting into the groove. Do get out and do some exercise, particularly if you're working from home, which these days, of course, is a far more common way to be. And be particularly mindful of your work-life balance. And that can be tricky to do if you're passionate about the tech. And I think that's one of the few downsides for many of us who are working in an industry which is very closely linked to our hobbies and other interests, is that it's far too easy to just have a poor work-life balance. Know when to jump. This might seem a little bit of a strange thing to say just after you've got the job, but if you land, this is actually not for me. Sometimes it makes sense to trust your spidey sense and pull the pin earlier rather than stay longer, because I think, again, because of that, we're often working in our own hobby, we do end up in a situation where we stay longer than we should. So a little bit of a digression, just to talk about some health stuff. I'm obviously not a doctor or a psychologist or psychiatrist or anything like that, but our physical and mental well-being are obviously very, very important and inexorably linked. I should not use words that are hard to pronounce in slides. But if you think about our profession, ours is in the main a pretty sedentary and often quite solitary pursuit. So do get out, do some exercise, spend some time with your friends. Sitting and standing in front of your computer all day is probably not the best thing to do for your body. If you find it difficult to take breaks, get a timer. All the modern operating systems have variations on this where you can set a timer. So you're only working for 50 minutes, then it'll either force you to get up for 10 minutes and go for a walk or do something. Eat more vegetables. No, really. Beer isn't in fact a vegetable, contrary to popular belief. But no, do eat well. And mental health is at least as important as the physical. As I said, and depression is a real thing for many of us. And this is where I'm going to sort of do a digression on a bit of a digression here and talk about my own journey a little bit. So this is a photo I took of a squirrel, for reasons which will become apparent in a moment. But I mentioned earlier that a lot of my school reports are along the lines of Blemings could do better if he applied himself. I had the reflection about 8 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago, that a lot of my peers seemed a lot more organised than I was, and perhaps more successful than I, whatever that might be. I think of a couple in particular who are CTOs, are quite successful. But they're also smarter than I am, I think. But I was like, okay, that's interesting. So while I was fortunate to have landed some more senior roles myself, I was still disorganised. I'm always doing everything at the last minute and sort of just, seemingly getting anxious because I've got to get this done in time and those sorts of things. But a chance conversation with a dear friend of mine in the States, they mentioned they had ADHD, and we got talking about this, and I thought, okay. And so I looked into this a bit. It actually did a basic set of diagnostics with the GP, the general doctor that I was working with at the time for usual health stuff, but the results kind of came back a bit inconclusive, so I kind of parked it. Okay, maybe I'm just lazy, as it turns out, or just disorganised, and kind of gave up, I guess, a little bit on that. A few years ago, 3 years ago, I moved down to the southwest Victoria, about four hours drive from here, and working with a new GP just on boring stuff like cholesterol and all the rest. They asked a quite pivotal question and said, well, what about your mental health? And I said, well, I'm prone to it. I get a bit blue and a bit anxious, and if I don't exercise enough, I feel pretty glum. And I really sort of scatterbrained, and I find it really, really hard to do stuff, be organised and that sort of thing. And I'm in a reasonably senior role, and I figure I should be more organised, She said, well, you've thought about ADHD? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I had, but I did the tests before and didn't really come back very, very conclusively. So So I think we should do them again. So I went ahead and did the more of the diagnostics, and I'll some more diagnostics, and sure enough, they came back quite time myself in nuts, with a much more strong sense that yes, ADHD was probably going to be a thing for me, and a bit of imposter syndrome even starting to creep in at this point. So, for those that are the back sort of photo, author taken in a reasonable likeness of my brain some days, and I thank my lovely sister for the sort of squirrel kind of thing. So, everyone's ADHD is different, and I'm not purporting to speak for anyone else, anyone other than myself in this case. But what I've come to realise is my brain is very much like a squirrel. It's like, oh, what's that over there? When my sock drawer is impeccably organised when there's a deadline approaching. I don't have the physical aspects so much, ironically. Like I can just sit around and it's completely fine. But for other people, it's a very, very different part of the journey. The process of getting a full diagnosis here in Australia is reasonably involved. You actually have to have as it stands at the moment, at least in Victoria, have an assessment through a psychiatrist, and they run through it. And even that was kind of telling, because it's a very capable and quite warm psychiatrist. But as we went through the more detailed analysis that they had me do, he just said, you know what, Hugh, you're kind of actually on the border a little bit in terms of what we'd normally class as ADHD, and this mostly has implications in terms of potential treatment regimes. But he said, in your case, I can tell you're reasonably smart. I tricked him. But you've probably had this since you're a kid. You've developed coping mechanisms over a period of about 40 or more years to understand how to work around this, how to put sort of frameworks up and so forth to sort of manage it. And it was one of those conversations that for me was quite transformational. I thought, well, that explains why any time where I'm trying to get stuff done and really, I'm just bone tired because I'm using all these extra cycles just to keep my brain on track on the task du jour. So it was quite a pivotal conversation, it's fair to say. Confirmation bias is always a bit of a difficult or dangerous sort of thing, that sort of expression, if all you have is a hammer, suddenly everything looks like a nail, because of course suddenly everyone I knew has ADHD, right? But more seriously, I talked about it fairly openly, I guess very openly now. But I did mention it to a couple of dear friends in the free and open source community, and ironically one had actually had a very similar experience just recently themselves and found a particularly good book on the topic, and our friend who was also on the call said, oh, that all sounds eerily familiar, I should probably go and get that checked. And sure enough, as I gather, they've found a similar sort of thing themselves. I was pretty candid about it at work. At Grafana, it's a pretty, we've got a pretty caring kind of a culture, and transparency is important, so it's a pretty safe place, I'd have to say. But it was actually quite empowering to be able to say, look, you know, to both my team, the people I manage, and my peers, it's sort of, if you ask me to do something, or I say I'm going to do something, I forget, please remind me. It's not me being lazy or forgetful. It's actually just my brain is sort of a bit wired differently, and I don't always remember these sorts of things. Another aspect of it, which I thought was worth sharing, is may or may not be aware that ADHD is very hereditary. And I had the situation where once I found out about this, I mentioned it to my broader family, and a wonderful family member has since found out that it's part of their makeup as well, quite a little differently to mine, but they've now been able to get some also help and maintenance to work through that. And it's been transformative for them. They're already a super, super smart individual in the first place, but just going to these new heights now that they've had that. So it was quite telling too that, as it turns out, a common misdiagnosis of ADHD is depression. But the medications used for depression are often exactly the wrong ones you want to use for ADHD. So I suppose it's worth getting checked. But I think the big relief for me was that just to realise that I'm not, and for that matter, we're not broken. So, thanks. So I'm still working through what to do about it, which is probably apparent from this talk. But just simply knowing it's there was pretty empowering. Oh, one final thing I did want to mention too, just as a data point. Exercise is thought to be particularly important in managing ADHD, hence the linkage to the exercise I mentioned earlier. But what was interesting for me is that there's a growing body of research that suggests in particular exercise that uses the balance part of your brain is particularly helpful for ADHD. And as I reflect on my own journey, the times when I was most organised and most productive have to be when I was fit, and I got fit by cycling, so which is obviously fairly balanced right. All right, back on the free and open source open hardware and something for some people managers. Do we have people managers in the room? Oh, please don't let me fall flat, come on. Through a few, good, okay. Hopefully all the rest of them are busy watching it on tape. So I'm back, unfortunately back in the role managing a team of software developers, really, really wide range of backgrounds, time zones and geographies for that matter, but that's given me a few perspectives, and I've been fortunate to be involved with some stuff at work where we've been identifying technical organisational culture and how we build successful ones there. So I'm going to share a little bit just based on those observations. Flow time is something we've identified as enormously important, and I'd encourage all of you as individual contributors, but also the managers in the room to find or protect flow time. That is to say, make sure you've got time to work uninterrupted. We encourage our teams, everyone at Grafana, to block out chunks of time in their calendar so that people don't schedule meetings there. It may seem obvious, but it's transformative, and as my wonderful manager describes it, it's okay for managers to be interrupt-driven, but not for individual contributors. They should be allowed to just not have to do task or context switches continuously in order to accomplish what they need to. You're probably managing introverts. You might even be one yourself, but bear that in mind when you're organising company events. I continue to be amazed when I hear of company events where it's all about loud music for a crowd of people who probably don't actually want to dance and would probably rather just have somewhere quiet to listen to some music softly in the background and get on with their thing. As a people manager, I would encourage you to set yourself the goal as being at least as good a people manager as your engineers are engineers, or whatever the individual contributor roles is that they have. And if you don't feel you can do it well, maybe don't do it. And I don't say that to be anything disrespectful, but just simply that the people aspect of the role is the most important part of it, and if you fail to do that well, it can have some pretty real consequences for the people you manage. So please take it seriously. Bit of a digression. Learn cool tricks from your colleagues, and this is in the context of, so how you're in the role, how do you stay current? It's pretty hard to beat looking over a colleague's shoulder. Now these days it's almost going to be certainly going to be virtual, and I don't mean it in a weird way. Obviously, get their permission. This isn't a hacking exercise. But this is one tip I learnt, which I wouldn't have seen if I hadn't been looking over Tridge's shoulder that morning. I said, oh, that's a cool trick, and filed that away for a rainy day. Do something in another part of the stack. I touched briefly on small memory footprint systems, embedded systems, that's the thing earlier on. Do something that's not part of your regular job, and do it on your own time if you need to be, but probably do it in another part of the stack. If you're a big systems programmer, do something in the embedded space or somewhere in between. If you're an embedded programmer, write something that's much further up the stack to get some familiarity with those different parts of the system. Play around with metrics, logs and traces, for example. Play around with systems that are somewhere in between. Our modern microcontrollers, things like the ESP32, ESP8266 would have been a supercomputer not so long ago, but they're still just a different mindset for your programming. Start today with security. These are pretty obvious sorts of things. But take the lid off or tinker with old hardware, or if you're a bit squeamish around screwdrivers and soldering irons, and the pointy end is generally the hot one with the soldering iron, just watch teardowns or those sorts of things. But my message here, I guess, is just take some time to understand the full system, because no matter what your role is overall in the software development or the engineering life cycle, you'll be better at it for knowing more of how the system works overall. Make hay while the sun shines. Unfortunately, we're in a pretty volatile job market now, and so I'd encourage you to at least stash a few bob away for a rainy day in case things don't go quite as expected. Keep your people networks ticking over. I spoke about that earlier as being a good way to find a job, but you want to kind of do it genuinely, but keep those connections going, because you never know when you might need to talk to Fred or Sue and say, actually, I need a job. And if it's the first time they've heard from you for a couple of years, then that can be a bit rubbish. Keep an eye out, in a similar vein, keep an eye out for the next steps where you might want to go next in case you need to do so. Unexpectedly, I touched on learning new skills earlier, but should the unexpected occur, just a few thoughts on that. Don't panic. It's pretty rubbish if you've lost your job unexpectedly, to put it mildly. But going out in a Twitter storm won't help. It might make you feel better for about 30 seconds, but then it will just work against you for the permanence of the internet from there. It's not personal, and this, I've actually been in this situation twice now myself, where some company restructures or whatever has meant I've found, oh, I don't have a job anymore. That's a bit awkward. But it was put to me really, really well. One of the sessions that we did, the company I was working for at the time had a particularly gracious way of doing, it was the first time they'd done layoffs and so forth, and they handled it particularly well. The point they made in one of the sessions, sort of to help us get back on the wagon, as it were, was it's not personal, and it might seem like a strange thing to observe, but if you reflect what's happening, the business has made a decision. The role you were doing is the thing that has gone away. You just happen to be the poor bunny that was in it at the time. But it's not because you're a good or a bad person. You're just a bit unlucky on that day. I don't say that to minimise the distress it causes, but just to offer a different way to frame it if you do find that yourself in that situation. It's not you. It's just the company's done something, so I think it's the role that's gone away and so forth. Is it legal? This is where you need a lawyer. I'm obviously not one. But if you think it's potentially an unfair dismissal, and that's something you want to look at pretty closely, because there are some fairly short windows on acting on that. The aftermath. So it's normal to feel a bit rubbish, obviously. So self-care is even more important than it ever was at that point. Start reaching out. Don't assume people will remember you. But reach out and ask people for opportunities, and just kind of keep those sorts of things going. It's okay to follow up periodically. If you've ever been in that situation yourself, someone might have asked you, "Hey, Fred, you got any work going?" and you forget to get back to them. It's probably exactly the same for the person you're talking to. So do follow up with them. Don't feel that there's I haven't heard back from them, they're not interested, or they've got nothing for me. Just kind of come back from time to time. I'd suggest keeping your search discreet for the first week or two. You don't need to immediately flip the bit on your preferred job search engine or job website to say that you're looking for new work. You might be able to find something more discreetly, as it were, and just kind of keep things ticking over that way. And beware of imposter syndrome, and this is a particularly telling one, I think, because self-doubt can certainly creep in. And I remember having a conversation with a dear friend of mine who's a really well-known, really well-respected, I'd almost say elder of our open source community, and they had found themselves in a situation where they were out of work unexpectedly from quite a senior role, and this is someone you'd all know. I'm obviously not going to name them, sort of thing, but I'm sitting there listening to them recount this and I think, man, if this person can get imposter syndrome, what hope of us mere mortals got, sort of thing. But it really is a thing. But you're all really good at what you do, and it's a part of this broader thing, I think, of just having a bit of courage to back yourself. And I'm going to spend the next few slides and pretty much to wrap up with some thoughts on that. So something that's sunk in for me only really quite recently is you can actually accomplish a lot more than you ever thought. It's a funny trait, I think, of a lot of people in the open technical commons, and a lot, but sadly not all, maybe, engineers develop. There's a fair amount of modesty in there, but sometimes that modesty can actually work against you, because actually I can't do that, rather than just saying you can't. You get into this funny headspace. So I had this photo of the Shy Kid back in 1984, a little earlier, to kick things off. This is one, sort of a similar one, I guess, from around a similar area, and this is me doing sound and lighting at my high school. We were doing a production of Orpheus in the Underworld. I was doing lights, and I remember choosing lights because if you messed up a lighting cue, it was far less obvious than getting microphone feedback, sort of thing. So I really did not want to be that person out the front at all. I should add, that's my lovely sister in the background, who normally does smile, but she was looking rather disdainfully at what two people were doing off the frame there. And remember, this is 1984, so we are both fashion appropriate for the era. Anyway, suffice to say, not a lot of self-confidence, but since that photo was taken, as I touched on at the start of the presentation, I've played in bands, had quite a lovely experience of doing music in different ways, but it's always been very much in the background. I was the keyboard player at the back next to the drummer and the bass player, sort of thing, or whatever it might be, but very much in the very background. So this is last year. So I mentioned some music in passing, but this was something that was a bit new to me, because I'd only ever sung in the car. So I learnt to sing Back in 2014, I was still living in Canberra. I did some lessons with a great teacher there, Beck Taylor, and that sort of got me started on the journey, I guess, a little bit. And I sung Amazing Grace at her end of term concert. It was kind of cool because most of her students were kids or younger people. And there were two adults in there, but we still got to do the end of term sort of concert with everyone else. But that was kind of cool. I moved to Melbourne in 2017 and did some lessons with a teacher in Brunswick, which, to my shame, I've not been able to find their name, but I only did a couple, but it helped. But when I moved down to the southwest in late 2020, I started doing some lessons shortly thereafterwards with quite a force of nature down that way, a singing teacher by the name of Leah Oswin. And I went into Leah and said, look, I want to just get some backing vocals going because I think one day I'll want to join a band again and it's good to be able to do vocals and da-di-da-di-da. She said, okay, fair enough. And I did a couple of lessons with her and then went along to a workshop on musical theatre that was being run in the region. And actually, on my next lesson with Leah, I sung a song from My Fair Lady, and she's like, the local theatre company are auditioning for Cats, you should probably think about that. Okay. So I thought I'd have a go, and I won't spend too much time on musical theatre because that's an entire talk in its own right, but I figured I'd have a go at the ensemble. So this is the cast that sort of sing, do all the wonderful stuff in the behind the scenes, so to speak. But I sung a song from Gus, the song called Gus the Theatre Cat, as part of my audition for the ensemble. But I was quite wonderfully humbled to get actually offered the role. So, oh, okay. And I'm assured it wasn't just the hair, right? Like. So Gus the Theatre Cat's actually a poem from T.S. Eliot's Book of Cats, and some of you may have seen the musical, some of you may not. Some of you may try to understand it, don't. It's not really meant to be understood. It's meant to be a lot of fun. But Gus is the old theatre cat, and he's the one with a story or an anecdote for every occasion. And you've been sitting here listening to me for about 45 minutes. You can probably see a certain amount of typecasting going on at this point. But it's fair to say that there's a linkage there. So this is a shot taken by one of my castmates of us performing on stage. And so 2022, in July of last year, the Lighthouse Theatre, Holiday Actors and Warrnambool Theatre Company put on Cats. Jelly Oram, the character to the left, is the lovely Ali McLaren, now a dear friend. And I've got to say, the Gus the Theatre Cat's a duet. It was a privilege and just a joy to hear Ali sing her part of the duet each evening, and from only a couple of feet away, I should say. But it was another one of these occasions where I felt like I found my crew, my sort of kindred spirits, and I think I've always felt that in the open source community, and I'd sort of been peripherally involved, as I said, in theatre, but this is just a whole nother level of sort of homecoming. But for a geeky kid, and frankly a bit of a geeky adult, it was quite a wonderful jump to have made. Right, I'm going to do a couple of quick shout-outs. We're on the downward stretch, upward stretch, I don't know. Two quick shout-outs wanted to do real quick. I mentioned OpenPower previously. I'm no longer the executive director, but I'm still involved in a voluntary capacity. But I did want to touch on just one thing that happened since I last talked about it. One of the proudest moments as being part of the OpenPower community at the time was my own modest part in guiding the Power ISA, the instruction set architecture, the detailed specifications of the Power microprocessor architecture to be an open ISA, which gives us as an open technical commons two choices, or at least two now, in the open microprocessor space. And I think open computing, particularly at that low open hardware sort of level, is going to be tremendously important to our ongoing success as an open technical commons. It probably doesn't get quite the visibility it should, but I did want to just give it a bit of its due here. Thank you. So OpenPower have got some interesting stuff going on, both some Libre or free silicon implementations are on the way, and there's a Power Pi project, and you can sort of join the dots as to what that might be like. Quick glass of water, sorry. And I'd be remiss not to mention this wonderful bunch. I'm very proud to be of what my team and what we're doing overall at Grafana. It's not protocol to spend a whole bunch of time doing a commercial talk, so I won't. But you can try our pretty useful free forever plan. It's a surprising amount of data you can actually send up to our service, and it's actually free for life, so it's actually quite a useful thing. And we do have some open roles in APAC at the moment as well. Not a ton of them, but if they're of interest, please do come and have a chat to me. So, the final thing. I talked a bit about being an introvert, imposter syndrome, backing yourself, having people to encourage you, that sort of thing. And I also like to acknowledge my lovely partner, Kate, who's been extremely supportive through all the various twists and turns of the last few years. Thank you. So I thought I'd try and set a good example, put myself on the line a little bit, and hope it encourages you or doesn't have you running for the exit. That's the case might be. Anyway, I figure it's one thing to sing on stage with entire company and actors and musicians around you, or as I've done, and makeup on for that matter, and lycra. Yeah. But it's something else to do it solo, so I thought I'll try and give you a little a cappella rendition of Gus the Theatre Cat to close things out. So I hope it inspires you to try things you wouldn't have thought you would too. I have played in my time every possible part, and I used to know 70 speeches by heart. I'd extemporize back chat, I knew how to gag, and I knew how to let the cat out of the bag. I knew how to act with my back and my tail. With an hour of rehearsal, I never could fail. I'd a voice that would soften the hardest of hearts, whether I took the lead or in character parts. I have sat by the bedside of poor little Nell. When the curfew was rung, then I swung on the bell. In the pantomime season, I never fell flat, and I once understudied Dick Whittington's cat. But my grandest creation, as history will tell, as fire for fiddle, the fiend of the fell. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's most gracious of you. And I really am done, but I will just say one final thing. Sarah touched on this when we came in this morning, in her remarks this morning, but I had the good fortune to catch up with a few folk at dinner last night, and then seeing you all today. I think it's just so wonderful to be part of this community, and so wonderful for us to have the opportunity to be back together in person. I think it really is a great thing. Back yourself, you'll be pleasantly surprised what you can do, and I hope today there's been something in there that has inspired you in some small way as well. I've got some links which I'll share on my blog later. They'll be up by lunchtime, hopefully. Thank you again.